Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. Following the South China Sea disputes, a wave of patriotism has sparked heated discussions in China. American brands such as KFC and Apple have become the targets of patriotic protesters, while individual actors and actresses have been criticized by some members of the public for their unpatriotic behavior. How should we view the boycotting protests in this age of globalization? What are the differences between nationalism and patriotism? What are the potential risks of radical patriotism? And how does the younger generation in China view patriotism? To discuss these and other questions, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Li Xi from the Beijing Foreign Studies University and Professor Zhang Xudong with the Department of Comparative Literature of New York University. Before we start the interview, let's take a look at this background report.
A solemn flag-raising ceremony at Tiananmen Square with thousands of people attending. The ceremony is held every morning at sunrise and has been a tradition since the founding of New China in 1949. People say the national flag-raising ceremony makes them feel patriotic.
This is my first time here, and I'm so excited. I feel my country is rising, just like the rising of this flag and the sun.
Patriotism, also known as national feeling or national pride, is a universal value worldwide. But the understanding and behaviours of patriotism vary from people to people. With the recent tensions over the South China Sea, several Chinese cities have witnessed protests against KFC restaurants and other American-owned products and brands. These protests are strongly discouraged by the Chinese government. The People's Daily told the protesters that their behaviours were irrational and disruptive. Chinese people used to make similar protests against foreign imports at the beginning of the 20th century, when the country was invaded by Western powers. But since more than 100 years have passed, most of the public have realised the boycotting protests are not practicable in this age of globalisation. Teenagers in China have received patriotism education by learning history and visiting patriotism education bases since they were in primary school. The younger generation is also good at using social media to express their patriotism and political claims, sometimes in humorous ways. In the United States, patriotism, together with liberty, democracy and human rights, is praised highly as the ideal of the country and is accepted as part of the national consciousness. But US media have reported that patriotism in America has been on the decline in recent years. This decline, though, seems to have more to do with reactions to the symbols of American democracy than to its values.
Welcome back. What were your immediate feelings when you heard and saw news about the so-called patriotic protests against overseas products in streets like Beijing, Shanghai and other major cities? 11 of them were subject to such protests, which erupted after, the ruling from The Hague was released, and that, of course, made so many Chinese feel a little bit uneasy. What do you think?
Well, I was surprised, but at the same time, I expected this to be passing and accidental. I wouldn't even try to make a big deal out of it. I thought it was just quite accidental. Although nationalism and patriotism are very, very important, deep-seated issues, but I think these incidents are not to be taken too seriously or to be used as an indicator of some kind of a long-term trend or something.
Professor Zhang, perhaps you have lived in the United States for a long time. I'm not sure if we got such a broad spectrum of public opinions characterized by diversity. Therefore, he does not take it very seriously. We should learn to live with such differences in the broad. Is that becoming a normal phenomenon for our daily life, to protest or remain silent? What do you think?
Well, certainly this is not the first time that such a protest happened in China. But like every time it happened, it does not really do anything to help ourselves to be more patriotic or help this nation in any sense. Although although it happens more than one time, more than one location, and involves more than one individual, I do not think it's a mainstream phenomenon or mainstream mindset, because we can see that more and more people in China taking rational perspective to view this incident. They think it's useless, and moreover it could be harmful because like KFC, all those products, a lot of them, they're actually produced in China. So it's not really, in a sense, to say Apple is really American Apple. It involved a global effort. So I think such a phenomenon in China, although it happens, but it's not going to change much, and it's not the mainstream idea for most of people.
One hunch concerning the reluctance of the Chinese government might be that such boycotting behavior might lead to the unemployment of Chinese nationals if you boycott products such as Apple and KFC. I mean, if such restaurants have all been closed, what do you think of the tidal waves of unemployment? That will quickly become a political issue, right?
Yeah, I think the government does not have much incentive to really associate themselves with this kind of boycotting activities.
In fact, the understatement of my question, forgive me for interrupting you, the understatement of my question is whether you regard the issue of patriotism as a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it may inspire millions of nationals to show their passionate love for the country. On the other hand, you know, what the Chinese politicians are most concerned with during the period of transformation is social instability.
Exactly.
Go ahead your analysis about such a sentiment.
Right. Now, if we look at this incident happened recently, like the actress Zhao Wei and her movie, and also the protest against the KFC, although, like I said, it's not a mainstream phenomenon, but we can read the message. If we think from the positive side, is that unity is still one of the strongest value in this nation. So, although me as an individual, I do not have much more channel to understand if there's more stories, what kind of stories behind those news. However, I can read the message from this is that Chinese people, or I think people of any nation, we do not want to see separation. We want us to live in a relatively stable atmosphere, to develop, to prosper. I think for this is the same as the government, right? So the government, I think they have no reasons to involve in such kind of incidents, and for rational citizens also against these kind of boycotting activities.
I agree with my fellow guest, and I want to add to that by saying that I think it's even a little far-fetched to suggest that the Chinese government stops short of supporting or endorsing it out of rational considerations. Even that, I thought, would be an understatement. Rather, I think that the state is overseeing this market economy development and the social stability, as you pointed out. And the incidents you pointed to took place rather in the consumer domain. I think these are to be viewed as isolated events, even though there are 11 similar attacks on the protests across China. But I think on the whole, these probably should be viewed as isolated the events.
Such protests may have been motivated by competitions commercially, right?
That's a possibility. The next door shop, the across the street competitor, but not in
But it's not about political perspective.
Not even on a systematic, sort of organized way. That's why I tend to consider these events as separated.
But I'm afraid your analysis about such behavior is perhaps undertaken in the context of globalization. On the one hand, patriotism is said to be one of the strongest universal values that we share around the world. On the other hand, we have an increasingly free movement of human resources, technology, ideas across traditional borders of nation states. And therefore, given the deep integration of Chinese economy into the rest of the world, it's so difficult, to protest and boycott overseas brands. Perhaps this is the strong understatement of Professor Zhang.
Right. And getting back to the conspiracy problem, and even if it's a conspiracy, even if it happens, who would really believe in those conspiracies? Who will be influenced? Because You see nowadays in China, for example, KFC, it opens more than 5,000 chain stores in China in over 1,000 different locations. Even though there's 10 different protesting that mentioned in the news, but the impact of it is really minimal. And the cell phone, right. If I buy an Apple cell phone, I have a lot of friends around me who buy Apple instead of a national brand cell phone, but it does not stop them from a patriotic person, I believe. Right. So I think even as a conspiracy, it might not likely to be effective. Chinese people's mentality, if I can say that, it's a paradox I see sometimes. On one hand, like Mr. Yang said, we love our own country, right? It's a national protest to say we are a stronger nation, and this is probably influenced by our contemporary history, because there is part of the history while China and the Western countries have very unhappy past, history involved. But at the same time, a lot of people, when they buy products, they favor foreign brands. It's a paradox. On one hand, people become nationalism, protest our own country, think we should establish on our own, free from invasion or any influence of the Western countries. On the other hand, when we get down to the reality, to products that influence our quality of life, we would favor foreign brands instead of our made in China products.
You are suggesting that it's a choice of consumers, not a choice of consumers of different national identity. Right. You are watching Dialogue with Professor Zhang Xudong with NYU and Dr. Li Xi with the Beijing Foreign Studies University. We are looking at the issue of patriotism and nationalism. When we come back, we'll take a further look at whether there are any differences between such two issues and the concepts. Please stay with me right back. Welcome back. Professor Zhang, what do you want to say about the protests that are getting violent sometimes, and that could take us back immediately to what happened in the year 2012 after the alleged purchase of Diaoyu Islands? Protests broke out in so many cities, first and second tier cities, where young students, consumers took to the street in protest against the Japanese discourse about the history of Diaoyu Islands and the issue of sovereignty.
Yeah, that was a much touchier issue, the Diaoyu Island. The Sino-Japanese relationship usually produces high emotions, But the protests you mentioned a moment ago, I wasn't really surprised by those. I thought these are just things happening, from time to time. I was truly surprised, though, by the counter protests. I wonder, people posting on the internet with a pistol, an axe on the table. People are dining at KFC. Say, those patriotic nationalist thugs just show up trying to challenge me, and I will kill you.
Ooh, yeah, that's a lot of theater in that.
It's too much political theater. So that kind of a protest, or KFC in this particular case, is used as a kind of a theatrical setting for some kind of a venting of internal political grievances or so it always ends up being a channel of communication for something else. So that I thought was equally interesting if we try to...
Usually, people, particularly Chinese, find it very difficult to question the integrity of being patriotic. Let me go back, therefore, in this context, to the United States, where young students are taught to salute the national flag, to repeat vows and express their deep love for the country. But the American media would never ever describe such a behavior as a nationalist, whilst it seems in other parts of the world, whenever there are anti-West sentiments, those who have such a behavior tend to be characterized with the expression of nationalism or nationalist sentiment, which of course obviously carries negative implications. What do you think, having lived in the United States?
Yes.
Do you have such experiences?
Yes. My kid went through all these things at schools, but I thought there is a very natural, unchecked celebration of American identity in America. There is this visible pride, and it's considered fully justifiable, even admirable, because Americans take great pride of their country, their institutions, their history, their culture, everything. And there's nothing wrong with it. Look at all these major sports events. There's American national anthem.
Well, that's a mimic warfare. It's a different occasion.
In all these occasions, it's, I think, simply put, it's my patriotism, your nationalism. If the same patriotic feelings, the love of the country, if it's expressed in a foreign setting, it's usually regarded as nationalism.
Come on, that gives rise to double standards, I'm afraid.
It's always
paradoxical
double standards. It's double standards all the way. There's no other way to look at it.
But then it's difficult to take patriotism as universal value any longer if you use double standards.
So
it's
actually,
becoming
there
very
are,
controversial.
sorry, we sort of to pile on this. I think patriotism and nationalism are two separate things. Patriotism, I think, refers to something rather natural. It's just a love of the country because you grow up here, it's your livelihood, you respect the customs, morals, and so on and so forth. Whereas nationalism is a historical phenomenon. It has to do with modernization, it has to do with universal education, print media.
Does it have anything to do with the ideology of Adolf Hitler, Nazi Germany, the Third Reich? Because its official ideology was the National Socialism. So in the understatement of some of the scholastic works, American professors would be very, very cautious as to the use of nationalism in describing the behavior of patriotism in the United States.
If I may add, I
Yes.
think that's the kind of extreme nationalism that people are aware of and trying to avoid. And when talking about nationalism, I think one thing, as I observed, that is different from China and America is that Chinese people, we have a strong concept in our mind as a country as a home. Well, as American, like Professor John, you live in America, I'm not sure if American people, when they talk about home, they mean more about individual, home built by individual effort, or a country as a home. So when Chinese people, when we talk about our country as a home, everybody has the responsibility to defend this country, to help this country, and to stay loyalty to this country. Although the concept might be similar in American people's mindset, but it could be different because in American society, I think there's not one thing called American identity, the same thing to unite people together. But there's something similar for every Chinese people because we're born and raised up in this land. We have the similar culture and history, and it's one race. Primarily, one race from this place for thousands of years. And once I had a conversation with an American friend, which I was very impressive, because I said, if once China war broke in China between other countries, I'm sure not a people they would want to join the army to defend for our nation. But the response from my American friend, which surprised me, he said, "Oh, if that's the case, I am not sure because some people may pack up in America and go to other safer places." So there's a different understanding about country, the concept about country. So in America, I think the idea about nationalism or patriotism is we love this place and we build this place to be a better one. We try our best to make this into a more democratic country, free country, happy country for people to live. But in China, it's like whatever our country is like, we would not abandon this country.
Chinese nationals, of course, share the Chinese dream for China to become more prosperous and happier for the ordinary folks. However, raging debates took place particularly on the vibrant social media, if not only on some of the pages of Global Times, a newspaper that not only enjoys a very big circulation in China, but also known for controversial points of view on particularly the issue of nationalism. Because most of the debates actually went back to the beginning of last century when we had the Boxers' Rebellion against overseas invasion, particularly European allies who invaded and looted Beijing. That became very bitter memories, and a lot of the Chinese nationalists are still awash with such historical memories. Upon the mere mention of patriotism or nationalism. So, what do you think of this part of the traumatic experience that caused a lot of internal bleeding?
Yeah.
And a lot of sense of history.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I think the choice of the word trauma pinpoints the issue. To some extent, Chinese nationalism, at least historically, has been this this thing born out of historical grievances. And that, I think, causes alarm in Western societies because grievances-based nationalism, historically, again, tends to lead to a sense of revenge or getting even with someone or with your own past. But I think over the past century and at the beginning decade and a half of the new century, Chinese society has become a radically different one. So
right.
I think it's a mixed sort of a historical construction now. I don't think there are too many people, especially among the younger generation, are still obsessed with this kind of trauma or grievance. Rather, they are more forward-looking. They are contemporaries of people in different parts of the world. And that's why based on this new consumer culture and consumer mentality, I tend to dismiss those protests as isolated incidents, rather trying to read too much out of it.
I think there are different understanding of patriotism or nationalism between wartime and peacetime. When the May 5 movement happened in the early of last century, we could see that China is really in a very dangerous situation. It's invaded, we lose the war, and they were dispute of colonization between Western countries, Japan, and other countries. At that time is a moment for a nation to survive.
Yes.
So now we're in the peacetime. In the peacetime, when we talk about nationalism or patriotism, especially patriotism, because we talk in a good sense, we do not have to antagonize the Western countries as our enemy.
Excuse me, your argument might be seriously challenged by a lot of others who say, look at the not very friendly, to put it politely, of the United States in the South China Sea. Look at the military presence of 2 aircraft carrier near the Philippine waters and of course near the contested waters of some of the islands and reefs in the South China Sea. And therefore, our relationship with the United States, for example, is largely defined by the alleged hostile attitude and the deep-rooted mistrust between these 2 biggest economies. Therefore, even if we live in peace times, there's still such a shadow of Cold War.
I understand that, and I think, right, I think it's common sense for everybody that any act, any behavior, if it is plotted and designed to provoke dispute politically, and if it is aimed to separate a nation, of course, there is enough reason to protest it. I think for any nation, any people, we have the same understanding. But even if that happened, right, even if that happened, by protesting KFC and other international brands in our own country does not really help to solve the problem, and it may give the excuse to foreign medias and people who do not understand what happens in this nation, put a label to say, look, Chinese people are so easy to be irritated. They're so irrational. Look at them protesting them.
Come on, give me a break. I'd like to look beyond the borders of China.
Yeah. Well,
for example, the Brexit. Yes, go ahead.
The South China Sea situation, I don't think it's the simple repetition of the sort of gunboat diplomacy, so to speak, the imperialist powers, the Western powers, sort of bullying China. It may, on the surface, appears to be something like that, but now the world order, the world system is so different. I think it's rather about something like America being the single superpower, trying to be the rule setter and the number
TPP one, or
the one who makes the rules. Whereas China, being the right power, of course, is feared to be playing the role of violently changing the rules or changing the game. That's the sort of the conflict we are witnessing in the South China Sea. It's a far cry from the old sort of the colonial era gunboats diplomacy, where as you put it, an entire nation, a civilization faces existential extinction. I mean, that of course bred a kind of a deep-seated nationalist sentiment.
The issue
you
of
refer to.
nationalist sentiment not only appeals to the mind and the heart of the Chinese nationalists, but also takes root in, for example, the Persian state of Iran and also the United Kingdom, which is one of the major powers of the European Union. Now it is decided to leave the European Union. So the referendum itself somehow reflects the nationalist sentiment or the importance of territorial sovereignty. After all, British sterling refuses to be integrated into the single currency of the European Union. It refuses to be a part of the Eurozone. And that gives rise to deep thought as to the level of economic development that may not necessarily decide the degree of your nationalism or being patriotic or not. What do you think of our perception of the United Kingdom?
To take on it.
United Kingdom, I mean, that's of course one of the front page stories of this year, 2016.
Right. UK as a nation, I think people in UK have very strong national pride as well, like other nations. Well, we can see its own tradition, and it has a lot of, let's say, culture symbols that has still maintained nowadays. They call themselves Britain. And it's interesting that within this nation, they have different, like British people and Scotland people, they have different heritage and cultural identity to call themselves a nation. I clearly see patriotism in the framework of Britain as well. And in China, it's interesting. Although we have different parts of our country, we have 56 different ethnic groups, and we have our own diversity. Chinese people, like I said just now, we love our nation like we love our family member, like we love our father or mother. We call this our motherland. I'm not sure if people in UK or US or any other place love their government as if they love their father or mother. Analogy is that, when the year 1999, when Macau returned to China, there's a song that everybody knows in China. In the song, it sings that the son has returned to its mother's home, like that. So I think that's an interesting phenomenon to observe about the nationalism of Chinese concept. That's probably difficult to find in
that
other
would be
nations.
unthinkable in the Anglo-American.
Very quickly,
context.
the last question, very quickly, before we wrap up this very enlightening discussion about the patriotism. What do you think should be the most reasonable and rational way of expressing one's patriotic sentiment if boycotting overseas products should be dismissed as unreasonable and harmful ways?
Well, that's actually a very complicated question. But simply put, I thought just to, if you love your country, you should fully participate in constructing it, a better society in your own country. I think that's the most rational and constructive way of demonstrating your love of the country.
Being constructive instead of destructive about your own behavior.
Being constructive includes being constructively critical.
That's a very deep thought.
Well, yes, I would simply say in peacetime, patriotism means that live your own life well, be a good person, do your job, have a good build your family well, and make your own contribution to be a constructive member of the society. I think that's the most important thing. If you build your own life well, like different individuals getting together, we make effort, we move the society forward.
Thank you very much. With that, we come to the end of this discussion about the sense and sensibility in the age of globalization. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.